Hey y'all, we're going to do a little bonus video today over something called Simpsons Paradox. As we start to get to these last chapters in the book and we start comparing data, we want to be really careful of this. It's sort of a trap that you can fall into. It's pretty common in statistics, and it's a really important concept that I think you should know before leaving this class. So we're going to take a look at a really famous example where the University of California at Berkeley was accused of discriminating against female applicants to their graduate school. So if we look at the data, it looks pretty bad. 44% of the males that applied to the school were admitted, whereas only 35% of the females were admitted. So this looks pretty damning. It looks like they might have had a preference for males. However, the statisticians at Berkeley said that this is not the whole story. We need to look a little bit deeper at the data. So what they did is they took all those applicants and they broke them down by department. So what we had before was the aggregated data. Aggregated just means it took all the data and put it together into one big category. But they said that's not fair to do. We actually need to look at each department differerly. Maybe Department A, maybe that's the computer science department. Department B, maybe that's the English department, and so on. So they said that each department had different acceptance rates, so it wasn't fair to look at them all together. So if we actually look at the data that's disaggregated, we actually can make the opposite argument. In Department A, 62% of men were admitted, whereas 82% of women were admitted. And that's actually true for most of these, where actually the preference seems to be for women. So this is called Simpsons Paradox because you can actually make both arguments depending on how you look at the data. If we look at all the data at once, it looks like males were preferred. A higher proportion of males were admitted. Whereas if we split it up by department, actually it looks like the opposite might be true. This is the most famous example of this, but we see it all the time. This mistake is made a lot in really important issues. Maybe two people are comparing schools. Let's say school A has higher test scores than school B. And that might be true, but there are other things that are really important we should consider, like what's the socioeconomic status of the students. It doesn't necessarily mean that school A or school B is doing a better job. We should really look a little bit deeper at the rest of the story. All right, we're gonna look at another example, which is not as important, but it's something I always think about when I'm looking at Simpsons Paradox. So let's take a look. All right, so let's say we wanted to compare two basketball players, Damian Lillard and DeMar DeRozan. So we want to figure out who's the better shooter. So we can do this by taking a look at their 2-point field goal percentage and their 3-point field goal percentage. So there's two types of field goals you can take in basketball, a 2-pointer and a 3-pointer. Free throws are not in this data. Okay, so it looks like Damian Lillard shoots 2-pointers a little bit better than DeMar DeRozan, about 1 percentage point higher. And if we look at 3-pointers, it looks like Damian Lillard shoots much better than DeMar DeRozan. But if we actually aggregate the data, so if we look at the total, if we look at the total field goal percentage, actually DeMar DeRozan has a higher percentage. You might want to stop and think about why. If you know anything about these two basketball players, you might already have an idea of why. It's because these 3-pointers are inherently harder shots than 2-pointers. Right? The percentages are usually, always going to be lower than these. DeMar DeRozan doesn't take a lot of these shots. So he only has a few 3-pointers, whereas Damian Lillard does a lot of this, right? He does a lot of these shots. So we have more of these sort of lower percentage shots dragging down his field goal percentage, which is why basketball statisticians like to use something called effective field goal percentage, which takes that into account. Basically, you get an extra point for this shot, which is why it's harder, so you get some bonus points for that. So if you look at effective field goal percentage, you actually see Damian Lillard has a higher overall percentage. So this is one way that basketball statisticians have sort of tried to fight around this paradox and get a better idea of the true story. Thanks, guys.